go. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. It's the same land acknowledgement I've been using every week, which is the one that the PCC Climate Communication Seminar came up with last quarter. So the land acknowledgement is, as we begin our gathering, we respectfully acknowledge that our event today is taking place on occupied land and that the University of Washington is on the homelands of the Duwamish people. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and the water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants. So today we're going to have, I think this is going to be a really interesting talks and conversation. So we're going to have two experts that have worked directly with communities in environmental justice and resilience. So we're going to start with Meade Krosby, who's a senior scientist with the UW Climate Impacts Group. She is also the University Deputy Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. Krosby has a PhD in biology from the University of Washington, and her professional mission is to support governments and communities in equitable and effectively conserving biodiversity in a changing world. And Esther has a PhD from the University of Washington and is a research scientist in the environmental and occupational hygiene. And I think she'll also talk about her work with an NGO, a non-governmental organization that works with communities for environmental justice and resilience issues. So I'm going to let Meade take it away. You should be able to share your screen. Looks good, Meade.
Unmute. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk about community engaged research, and I'm going to do it by focusing on a specific example. So I'll give you a little case study of some of the kinds of work that we do and how we do it at the Climate Impacts Group in the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So I'm going to talk about a large project that was aimed at supporting tribes in assessing climate risks to natural and cultural resources. So a vulnerability assessment is where we ask, how is climate changing? How is it going to change where I live? How is it going to affect the things that I care about? And what can I do to reduce those risks on the things that I care about? So I'm going to talk about the process that we used in creating resources to support tribes in doing vulnerability assessments. And I'm going to focus on how we strove to ethically and effectively co-create these resources with tribal partners to ensure that they would be useful and used by tribes. And I just want to start by acknowledging this was a really large collaborative effort that brought together university and tribal and federal partners, including a big team at the Climate Impacts Group and a tribal advisory group that I'll talk more about in a minute. So this project was developed as a direct response to work that was completed in 2015 by Don Sampson of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. So Don did a survey of Columbia Basin tribes, and he asked them about their capacity to respond to climate change. And he found that there were significant disparities among tribes. So some were making significant progress and others had barely gotten started. And this work was funded by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center to help identify areas where they could support tribes in doing climate work. And of the barriers that Don identified to preparedness, there were many that the CAS couldn't do much about. So there were social and political barriers they couldn't do much about. But there was one significant barrier, and that was gaps in technical capacity for vulnerability assessments that the CAS could do something about. So the CAS got in touch with me, and at the time I wasn't affiliated with the CAS, And they asked me if I could help develop a proposal to address the gaps that Mr. Sampson identified. And so the project was initiated in response to a need that was identified by the community that it was intended to serve. And as I go through, I'm going to kind of give you these big sort of best practices punchlines throughout. So this one is a really important one that we were responding to a need that the community had already identified. And so in designing this project, our goals in helping to fill gaps in tribal capacity for vulnerability assessment were to first provide climate data at the scale of tribal decision making. So there are a lot of really big regional, national, global climate data sets out there. They don't get you very far when you're trying to figure out what's happening where you live and affecting the things you care about. So we wanted to help make that climate data more accessible to tribes. We wanted to support tribal staff through the vulnerability assessment process. So you never just want to give people data. We also wanted to provide training and technical assistance in using it and in doing vulnerability assessments. And then we also wanted to make the vulnerability assessment process more accessible to tribal staff. So we wanted to produce a curated online collection of available tools and resources and guidance for doing vulnerability assessment, because there's a ton of information out there on this. And if you're just getting started, it can be like drinking from the fire hose. And so we wanted to provide like the water fountain, like how can we orient folks to the resources that are out there, and then they can take a deeper dive if they want to. So the scope of work for this project was designed in partnership with the Climate Adaptation Science Center, the CASC, and the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative to serve the tribes in both of those areas. And in designing the project, we worked with representatives from tribal organizations that were on the steering committees of both of those organizations that were funding this. And then we formalized that tribal leadership in the project by convening a tribal advisory group. And so this included representatives from tribal organizations and associations, from Bureau of Indian Affairs, from tribal climate networks, Indigenous scholars. And so all of this effort, from its very initiation in this design through its completion, was done in partnership with tribes. So it was designed and completed, again, with the communities it was intended to serve. And this was very important because as a white settler Western scientist, there is no way that I can anticipate what resources would be most relevant and culturally appropriate for tribes. So tribes are the experts on tribes. So ensuring the usefulness of this work and that we did it in the right way required that we were working closely with tribes and that it was being really led by tribes the whole way. So the first thing we had to figure out in delivering on what we were trying to do was what climate information to provide tribes. And so this project, again, was designed to serve tribes in the Northwest and the Great Basin. And before this project began, the only climate data that was readily available to most tribes in the region was future changes, projected changes in average annual temperature and average annual precipitation over the scale of tribal reservations. And we know that tribes don't just care about average annual temperature and precipitation at the reservation scale. So we know tribes care about snowpack and stream flow, for example, and a lot of other things that affect the resources that are important to them. And we know they don't just care about reservations, they make decisions at other scales. So we needed to know that too. Over what geographic areas are tribes making decisions around climate change, so we could get them information at that scale. So again, we didn't guess the answers to these questions. To know what information would be most useful to tribes, we needed to ask the intended users. We needed to ask the tribes in the Northwest and the Great Basin what information they needed. So early in the project, we did a survey and we delivered it to tribes, and we asked what impacts and what types of geographies they were most concerned with in thinking about climate change. And the answer was pretty much all of the above. And that really isn't surprising, because tribes are concerned about a broad array of impacts because they are so closely tied to the land and natural resources. And so everything that affects those is very holistic, the impacts that are experienced by tribes. So top of the list would be impacts on species or habitats, but also snowpack and glaciers and stream temperatures and changes in stream flows and wildfire and drought. There was a long list of things. So this was really helpful in letting us know the range of impacts that were of greatest concern for tribes so that we could take the huge number of climate data sets out there and curate them to best inform decisions around these things of concern to tribes. So when we asked about over what geographies they would want information about these things, again, we got a lot of different answers. Yes, reservations are important, but many tribes are making decisions at the scale of watersheds, and not just like one kind of watershed, but basins, from basins to tiny local watersheds. They're making decisions at the scale of their treaty areas or ceded areas. In Washington, usual and accustomed areas. And then a lot of tribes had really unique geographies that, from this horizontal, vertical line on the map to this, crest of this mountain. And so they were very unique, and they varied by tribe. So the answer was that there was no like one size fits all for the kind of data that we would provide. So we had to make the pretty difficult decision that if we wanted to give the tribes what they needed, we were going to have to ask every single one of them what they needed. And so to ask over what geographies do you need this data, we didn't just go to a tribe's GIS technician or contact a tribal community member, or we didn't contact the natural resources staff. Instead, we wrote formal letters to every tribal council chairperson for each of the 84 tribes in the Northwest and Great Basin. And I'll tell you, just looking up who those people were, because there are elections that differ for every tribe, sometimes every year, was quite challenging, but we found them all. We wrote them all a letter. We let them know what this project is, what the information is that we were requesting, and why. And we did this because tribes are sovereign nations. And so sending letters informing them of what this information ask was and what the project is, sending letters to each tribe's chairperson was a way of showing respect for tribal sovereignty. And so this is also known as going in through the front door. When you interact with tribes and do any research with tribes, you should always go in through the front door. So the letters served another purpose, in that they helped ensure that we were using tribal information ethically. So after we got responses from tribes, before we ever put the data out there into the world, we sent another letter. We said, here's the geographies that we got from you. And we didn't actually just ask for one geography. We're like, send us your top 3. And so we sent a letter back, and we sent like, the PDFs back of like the maps that, we had from them. And we said, here's what we got from you. Here's what we're calling it based on what you told us. Is it okay for us to use this information? It's going to be publicly available. So please make sure you didn't send us anything that you don't want the public to see when we make this information publicly available, these climate resources. And this was also incredibly important. This is called obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. And so that's really the only ethical way to use information from any tribe, and I would say really from any community, is to make sure that they were giving it to us freely. We told them before we ever use the information what we were going to use it for and how we were going to use it, so they were informed. And they had to give us consent for us to use it, and that consent can be taken away at any time. And so this tool's already done, the information's out there. If the tribe says they don't want it up there anymore, we'll take it down. So that was really important as well. Okay, so we sent all these letters. We had a lot of follow-up, a lot of phone calls from folks who, were like, what did you say we're gonna use this for? There's a lot of really reasonable skepticism for anyone who didn't know us already around like, why are you asking for this information? There's a bad track record of researchers asking for and using and misusing tribal information. But after a lot of engagement, we received custom geographies from well over half of the tribes in the Northwest and the Great Basin. And they totally varied from like a lot of watersheds and basins, but also like counties or different municipalities, a lot of tribally specific geographies like ancestral territories or treaty areas, usual and accustomed areas. So it was really important that we asked this, because we could never have anticipated some of these areas that tribes really care about, over which they would want to make decisions and get this climate information. Okay, so then we had to make the information available to them. And so we built a tool. We built an online free tool that makes it really easy for anyone to get hold of the climate information that we prepared for them. So you just go onto the tool, you click your tribe, you click your area of interest. And again, they could send us up to 3, because they might make different decisions at the scale of a reservation than they make at a huge seeded area. And so we wanted to make sure they could choose several different geographies to look at. So then, for example, here, looking at the Yakima subbasin, I could look up how 20 different climate-related variables will change over time, from snowpack to stream temperature, fire risk, vegetation change. So there's a whole broad suite of variables that are available on this tool. You can choose to look at it as a map, to choose the time period of what you want to see. Maybe you want to know what's supposed to happen at mid-century versus end of century. Maybe you want to look at different carbon emission scenarios to see how that affects the change. You can look at it spatially here in the map. There's a table, there's a text description. So we presented many different ways to access the information. You can download the information. You can also look at a graph to see change over time, and the range of possible futures based on different models, or the mean of the models. So we made it available in a way that could be accessible by many different people, depending on how they want the information. They can download the figures, the maps, and the graphs, and the data. They can create a custom report that they can choose what they want in this report, what data they want included, and it'll generate a big report of anything that they want to see. And again, the key here was that we wanted to make the tool easy to use, make this information really have a low barrier to entry for getting this information. And again, we didn't guess if this tool was easy to use. We solicited feedback and did user testing throughout its development to make sure that it was easy to use. So again, we went to the community, and we did some really cool remote user testing, where we set up a time, and someone would share a screen, and we'd send them the link, and then we'd just say nothing, and they would use the tool and kind of think out loud, and we could hear what was working and wasn't working, what they wish they could have seen, or how they didn't understand this, how we could make that more understandable. So we did that. We did several rounds of things like that as we developed the tool. And then again, you never just want to put information out there into the ether, because often you can put out really fantastic tools and information, and people might never use it if they don't know about it, or they're intimidated by it, or maybe they use it, but then they don't really understand what's happening with it. And so it's really important to provide support for the use of tools and resources we put out, particularly in working with communities. And so part of this project was having a technical support desk. So basically, if you had any questions about climate change generally, but then also about the tools or the resources we put out, you just give me a call, and I will walk you through it, or I'll connect you to someone, if I don't know the answer, who will know the answer. So I can connect you to my network. I try as often as possible to connect tribes to other tribes who've said that they're interested in doing that kind of peer-to-peer. And so we received, and we continue to receive, calls and emails from around the West. And the questions vary because the tribes vary so much in where they are and what they're doing. They vary from, like, I'm monitoring, this glacier. What kind of data logger should I use to monitor this glacier? I'm like, I don't know, but I can send you over to, this person who I know who knows the answer to that. And hi, I have a vulnerability assessment due in like 2 months, and I'm really stuck. Can we talk about this? Like, what are some approaches I could take to get this thing done? To what kind of climate information is available for my tribe? Like, what's on this tool? How do I use this thing? So the questions we got were totally variable depending on the tribe. And it was super helpful, not only like hopefully for the folks that I was answering questions for, but it was really helpful for us in helping us know how to design this online guidance that we were going to provide too, to help walk people through the vulnerability assessment process. And so we designed this curated online collection of available tools and guides and data sets and approaches. And we designed it based on the calls that I was getting, like the range of calls I was getting on the help desk. So it starts from like, you're just in the beginning, you're just raising awareness. You're like, what is this whole climate thing about? So you can start out with like, how's the climate going to change and why? Why does it matter for tribes? How is it going to change for my tribe? And so you can click on any one of these buttons and it takes you to like it's sort of like a choose your own adventure. And you can start out really shallow and you can get much, much deeper, but it's sort of like, it's designed to meet you where you are. And then again, it's the water fountain and we will show you where the fire hose is, but we're orienting you to what's out there. So this is for the folks sort of just starting out. We have other folks who are ready to do a vulnerability assessment and want to know like what are the different approaches that are available. And so you can click on here and learn about, and again, all of the resources, we tried as much as possible to use resources that were designed by and for tribes in building this. So if you want to, you're curious about Indigenous approaches to vulnerability assessment. So some tribes have done vulnerability assessments that actually use very little Western science at all. It's really strongly rooted in tradition and Indigenous knowledge. And so we have examples of tribes who've done that and we have their assessments and you can go check those out. Other tribes have taken a very Western science approach and the assessment wouldn't really look that much different from something from like a federal agency or a state agency, except for what they're looking at, which is like culturally important species or resources. So you can check those out. And then some tribes combine both approaches. And actually, I would say most tribes do. And so you can check out examples of assessment from those. Tribes also want to know how to engage communities and youth and tribal governments in their assessments. And so we have resources from tribes on how to do those. And then all of this is intended to get folks to the point where then they can figure out like how to do adaptation planning and prepare for these risks and lower them. Right, and you also need to fund it and get support for it and connect with others doing that work. Okay, so we also wanted to make sure that in addition to providing these online resources and tools, that we were also providing training, hands-on training, like getting people on it and using it. So we did webinars and workshops to orient folks to this. And also it gave us more feedback. So we refined the tool further after watching people use it in person in their questions. And we had tribes come in cohorts that like 3 folks. And these could be, we had youth come, we had elders, staff, like it totally leaders. I mean, it totally varied who from this tribe decided to come to these workshops. But we encouraged cohorts to come and then we had a lot of networking between cohorts. The workshops, it was very important that we included funding in the proposal to support community members in coming to these workshops. So folks were paid and supported to come to these. They were hosted by tribal organizations or tribes. So they were known messengers, they were trusted messengers who were like, come to this workshop. We had champions in each of these regions. We held them across the regions. So we went to where the tribes were. We went to Nevada, we went to Oregon, Washington, and instead of asking or expecting tribes to come to us. And the thing that was really important about doing these trainings and webinars and was again, the goal really in doing this work was to build capacity and communities of practice for this work within the tribes who had gaps in that capacity. And this is a really important part in working with tribes or any community in transferring, like the transfer of the expertise that we have to the community. So we're leaving the community with more than we took from it. We had asked tribes for information. We asked them to send us, to do a survey and take, send us your geographies. We want to make sure we're leaving tribes with way more than they gave us. And so, making sure we're leaving with the tool, but also then the skills to use the tool. And so they don't need to keep calling the help desk, like we're giving that information and learning a lot in return through this whole process. So when we were done with the project and we had released the tool and the resources and done all our trainings, we were all really happy, the whole partnership, with how this all turned out. We were happy with the process and how that went. We were also happy with what we produced and the fact that these things were all really useful and appreciated. And so we wanted to share the story of this effort. But before I approached like UW News about maybe writing a press release about this, I first reached out to our partners and said, is this the kind of like, would you welcome something like this? Is this something we want to talk about and you know, sharing, like having a media release for this? And people were really excited about it. And so then we had to think about how to craft, you know, a story that would serve the tribes, like that, making sure that whatever we did was going to serve the tribes at least as much, but hopefully more than it would serve like UW. And so we wanted to draw attention in how we crafted the story to climate impacts faced by tribes. We wanted to emphasize their leadership in responding to climate change. We wanted to use our experience as an example of successful partnership among tribes and federal agencies and universities. And so we wanted to make sure that tribes were at the center of the narrative of the story we told and that they were telling their own stories. So I wasn't speaking for them, staying in my lane as a Western scientist. And so we released a shared press release in collaboration with our tribal partners. For more information, it wasn't just me, it was also, they could contact folks from the tribes, and they did. And then we had some really lovely pieces come out of this in different outlets, talking about the process and the products and the sort of melding of Western and traditional knowledge throughout this effort. So the key here was making sure that we were centering tribes, that we center communities when we do this work together and how we communicate that work. And so one last thing is that, you know, the funding is done for this work, the project is done, but the help desk is still open. I'm still, if someone calls, I'm still going to answer. If a tribe gets in touch and says, oh, we never sent geographies, and you know, for this tool, we really want to get our custom geographies in it, we're still going to do it. We're going to update the tool for them. And I'm still working with many different tribes in the Northwest and tribal organizations. And this is all really important because helicoptering in and out of communities to do research is extractive and harmful, and it undermines trust in academic institutions and in Western research. And so it's really important that we commit to sustained relationships when we work with communities and when we work with tribes. And so the products and outcomes of this work, we successfully delivered climate data and resources that were tailored to the needs and capacities of Northwest and Great Basin tribes. We enhanced capacity and communities of practice among tribes for doing climate change vulnerability assessment. And then it also informed scholarship about, you know, and lessons learned about how to do this kind of co-production of knowledge for actionable climate science with communities and with tribes. And just sort of a summary of those practices for ethical and effective co-production, intentional and iterative engagement throughout the whole process, not just like we did a project and then we delivered a talk at the end of it, but like actually doing a project with the community it's intended to serve. In the cases of working with tribes, making sure that we respect tribal sovereignty and treat them as sovereign nations, that we use community information ethically, especially with tribes, that we observe, that we obtain free, prior, and informed consent, that we always build capacity in communities of practice through our work. So we're having a transfer of knowledge, we're leaving more than we took from a community, that we center communities in project communications about any work that we do together, that is the stories about the communities and that work, and that we commit to sustained relationships. We don't ghost when we're done with our project, we maintain those relationships. We can be very tricky under soft money models of funding and academic institutions, which are not set up to support these kinds of sustained relationships. And I think that's something that if we really want science to serve society, we really have to address that gap and make sure that that kind of funding is around so that scientists are set up to succeed in working with communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Meade. I think we'll pass it off to Esther and then we'll hold your questions for later.
Hi, everyone. Give me a moment to share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Hi everyone. My name is Esther, and today I'd like to go over kind of the principles of engagement that I have. Principle of engagement that I have with communities, and give a couple examples of one of the more recent projects that I've been a part of. And so before all of that, I like to go over the definitions that I use, and I'm going to use a lot during this presentation, so you know kind of the nuances of what I'm talking about. And then about the principles of engagement and some of the best practices that I try to go by and strive for. And then some of the frameworks for climate impacts that were kind of outcomes of the various partnerships that I have. So environmental justice, and this is a term that the Washington Environmental Justice Task Force has recommended late last year. And this is a definition that really incorporates a lot of the different procedural justice and the distributional justice elements that come into a lot of conversations around climate impacts, climate justice. How do we how do we make sure the right people are involved meaningfully? And how are we going to change the impacts, whether it's in the past, whether it's something that we might feel in the future? And so the definition goes, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of who they are, where they're from, what color their skin is, and thinking about the intersectional lens to address disproportionate environmental and health impacts by prioritizing highly impacted populations and equitably distributing resources and benefits and eliminating harm. So for frontline communities, this is a term that's used often. It comes across in the climate impacts world and climate change conversations. And so the term I like to refer to is thinking about who's on the front lines of these injustices, whether it's historical past or in the future, because often, there's a very close linkage to each other. So communities that experience continuing injustice, including people of color, immigrants, people with lower incomes, those in rural areas, and indigenous people that face a legacy of all these different inequities that influence where they're living, places where they work, the quality of their air, water, and economic opportunities. And so I'll use these terms throughout the presentation. There are a couple other terms I'd like to use, and this is I won't go into much depth here other than that when I think of and talk about vulnerability, it includes thinking about not just a person's susceptibility to harm, but also the community or the social system that creates that vulnerability. And when we think about resilience, it again kind of goes from people, community, and to the broader social system as well. And then thinking about adaptive capacity or the capacity to cope, adapt, or prepare for climate impacts all play into today's presentation. So community engagement and research, this cycle is what I like to strive for, is, jointly identifying research goals together, similar to the earlier presentation, co-designing the study and identifying the, how you're going to execute the project and what data collection and analysis you're going to do. Also thinking about once you actually do the data collection, how are you going to analyze it together, and how are you going to interpret it? When are you going to do that, and who you're going to do it with, and who you're going to disseminate the information to, how you're going to communicate it in addition to the traditional peer-reviewed journals that academics think of. And so it becomes a cycle where once you do that, more questions come up, more needs come up. Some folks may have different solution suggestions. And so again, it's this cycle that is always ongoing. And like Meade had mentioned, it's not just about that one-time study. It's a continuation of a relationship through the partnerships that you have, whether it's a single community organization or with a network of communities. And oftentimes, actually, for a lot of my partnerships, I work with government organizations and staffers in government agencies as well, whether it's local or statewide. And so just thinking about, the wide range of people to engage and to work with really brings a lot of the complexity that you're looking here. This is a model of community-based participatory research that many of you have seen, but really thinking about the context of where you are at, both physically, but also with the organization that you're with. What's the culture there? What health issue is of most importance? What history of collaboration has there been? And it might not even be me. It might be the University of Washington as a whole. It might be it might be just all sorts of different flavors. And so making sure I incorporate these contexts when I'm even thinking about starting a project or approaching a partnership or starting a conversation. And that all goes into thinking about the partnership structure itself. And then, of course, the partnership will do various activities together, hopefully, many of which will lead into interventions and research, since that is what University of Washington does. But this is where that co-production of knowledge, that co-production of that co-decision making, sharing power, designing research together, all of that plays such a big part and feed into each other, hence seeing arrows that basically point to each other everywhere. And then thinking about the outcomes of that partnership and the project itself, because of course we're always thinking about answering the specific aims and the research questions, but thinking about, well, what is going to be the outcome of this project that makes it relevant to communities that they've been looking for the answer. That's why they, asked us to start a research project or whatnot. And then thinking about the long-term community transformation, social justice, and health equity. And so there's a whole range of activities, a whole range of community engagement continuum. And of course, not all of them can be at that very right level, which is that shared leadership of bidirectional relationship, final decision making at community level. The partnership is very strong, and the outcome is, to broader health outcomes and reducing and eliminating health disparities in the long run. But all the different engagements, I really strive to make sure, even if it's a new relationship, we're not there yet, we're still just talking about building a partnership, I really strive to be on that right side rather than just doing the outreach and consultation side, but more on the collaborative and shared leadership, which is always hard to do. The other things that are super hard to do but important to do is thinking about trust between partners, being sensitive to any past, mistrust there might have been. For example, University of Washington, some group that I might walk into a conversation with and start talking to might have had an issue in the past or might have had great relationships in the past. So being mindful of that and always listening first to see what people have to say has been a priority for me. Communication has always been very important, and this takes place in so many different methods, especially because academics, I think, we're always on our email, and that may not be the preferred method of communication for many folks, especially ones that are actually just out in the field doing, data collection or actually in clinics or doing outreach and education. And so being mindful of that and making sure that you're being respectful of the communication preference and also providing that space to have that honest bi-directional communication is super important. And respect for community knowledge and skills is super important, in a sense that all communities have their own skills and their own strengths, and being able to amplify that and build that capacity is a critical element. And then all of that rolling into ultimately that power sharing level that we want to do, that shared decision making level we want to do, so that we're deciding together on what our next steps will be, what the research design will be, what will we analyze first, because of course we always collect many different data sets. And so what's the first question we want to answer, because time is of the essence. And then really knowing your community and trusting and understanding that trust in the community is super important. And also along those notes, thinking about what potential challenges or actual challenges and barriers there might be. So thinking about funding and funding structure, who dictates the conversation, and how do we make sure that it doesn't seem that it's not ultimately ends up in that way. So, a lot of these NIH fundings are mainly academic institution led, but how do we make sure to elevate our community partners' voices and prioritize them, perhaps making them a co-PI on things. Also balancing the administrative burden that these things often bring, which is a lot of paperwork and takes 9 months to set up these subcontracts, and thinking about priorities for different organizations, because for University of Washington it's research, but for a community health center, they actually provide health and clinical care, so that's going to be their priority. So how do you really balance both can be difficult. And then analyzing data together, in addition to collecting data, really analyzing data together can be super difficult, because for us, we just open up our software and punch out some things. But how do you do that together? How do you build the capacity of your community partners if that is something they want to do? And how do you design the project so you can do this together, so it's not just a researcher that's leading this effort on their own? and thinking about, the time demand that it takes to build relationships. As you saw with the Meade's presentation, it takes a lot of time, and oftentimes that isn't really necessarily a budget item that you are compensated for. You can't say, well, trust building activities and have that in there, um, necessarily. And so it becomes actually a huge barrier for many community partners and academic partnerships to succeed ultimately. And so being mindful of this when you start off is super helpful. And so with equitable decision making and governance, the reason why I really emphasize bringing community voice to the table, and not just that, but power sharing and equitable decision making, is, through these meaningful participation and making sure that they have access to the information and the decision making process and venues, and making sure that there is actually representation from those most impacted in the decision making. Um, you really actually, I think, get to the best solutions at the end that are more applicable to that community. If you're trying to help them or trying to create a solution for them, it's better to do it with them, because they know their issue at best, and they probably have the better ideas compared to someone that, moved up here from California, that has no clue what that community nuance looks like, what the struggles have been. Who best to talk to than the people that are actually living the day-to-day experience of the climate impacts. And one of the things that's really difficult to do, but I always try to keep in mind, is really my positionality of what I bring when I'm walking in through a door as a Asian woman that moved here from Korea, that used to live in California, so now a transplant in Washington. Thinking about what does my face kind of represent, who do other people in that room represent, and thinking about who's not in that room also is super significant when you're thinking about the power and the privilege that people bring, and thinking about who should we intentionally reach out to even more, because they, for whatever reason, are not able to be present in that space and present in that room. And so here's an example. I work part-time for Front and Centered, and they actually hold several different listening sessions for so many different issues, whatever the issue might be up front. On the picture on the upper right is, examples of what those different community listening sessions look like before the pandemic. And even during the pandemic, they're hosting many different conversations throughout, even with the technological challenges that we have. But really having that multicultural, multilingual conversations about the different pollution or climate change or sensitivity or resilience or adaptive capacity, all this has been very central to the work that I do at University of Washington and Front and Centered. And so over the last, since 2017, there have been a series of community listening sessions going on. We're slowly branching out more to the central and eastern Washington, and that being a huge limitation, but something that we're trying to be very mindful of and do more outreach on. And then we have some groups that we reach out to, on the Olympic Peninsula, but really having conversations about what they think of as a healthy, thriving community, and what the potential steps might be to get there. And so many different communities might mention the same thing, like folks saying, hey, air quality is really important to me, water quality is really important to me. The nuance of that and the details of that is so different, right? So for some tribal organizations, it might be, marine water quality where they get their fish out of that they eat. And for others, it might be surface water quality where they recreate, and they want to make sure that access to that is fine versus drinking water. So really thinking about the nuances is super important. And that's why it's critical to actually go to the community groups yourself, rather than inviting them to University of Washington in the rooms. You making that effort to go out there, even if it's, say, a 3-hour drive for a 1-hour meeting. It's really critical that you are present for those spaces. And so we hosted these various different listening sessions with 200 different people, I think 14 different locations. And we really talked about what is important to them when they're thinking about climate change, climate resilience, and what the impacts are for them now. And so one of the things that of the 3 key findings that we've found through these various engagement is that the magnitude and level of risk will worsen for these communities, and they're anticipating them. Thinking about, polluted water, they're considering about polluted air, thinking about asthma, and then especially now with COVID. So it's that cumulative impact that communities are very concerned with. And thinking about storms or tsunamis devastating the area and the communities at the riverbank. Thinking about, who those communities are that are going to experience these risks of climate risk the worst, and the basically on the front lines of it has been super important for community members to voice that. The other has been thinking about that many are more susceptible or vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Some have less resources. For example, this one person said, not enough resource for the low income or helping assistance. I don't qualify for insurance. I have never had insurance all my life. I just have to stay healthy and thankful I haven't gotten sick. Others have talked about, migrant workers and undocumented communities face the greatest challenge for climate changes based on where they live and their work sites, and especially thinking about COVID-19 and the challenges that many folks at say packing plants or harvesting sites have faced. You can kind of understand and get the picture of what that looks like day to day. And then someone talked about, I had to put an AC for the first time because of my disabled son who can't regulate his heat. I had to run it for most of the summer, and thinking about, what is that cost going to how is that going to impact that family, and whether, are they going to have to make the decision of, are we going to buy less food so that we have enough money to pay for that air conditioning to run all summer. The third finding has been really thinking about that adaptive capacity for individuals. They really felt like they needed more resources to prepare, cope, and adapt to improve the health of their communities. And especially for, again, low income and communities of color who really don't have the ability to escape. If you have money, you can move somewhere where it's not a problem anymore, but then thinking about communities where you have a lot of elderly people or people in poverty, what can they do? And so that really was a question that was posed by so many folks, and thinking about, how do you really create that resilience and create that adaptive capacity for communities in the long run when you're thinking about climate change and climate research. And so of the different conceptual frameworks that have guided a lot of these different projects, this is one in thinking about both the importance of vulnerability and the exposure of where you work or where you live or where you play. They all factor into what your relative overall risk is to environmental health disparities. Another in thinking about measuring climate impact is really, in addition to the climate change related hazard that we think about, like the flooding, like the increased precipitation, the drought, change in snowfall, all of that, thinking about resilience in that community, what's already there that you want to strengthen, and thinking about who is the more vulnerable even within your community, thinking about health conditions, thinking about poverty levels, who has the ability to actually respond or ability to change their environment to adapt. And so thinking about the adaptive capacity, these 4 elements have been really critical in my work, building up to now, where we're thinking about not just climate impacts, and we're thinking about, COVID post-recovery, what does that look like? And, thinking about climate impact in that sense, where we're, people are still going to experience things the way that they've been unless we do something about it. So one of the products that came out of this partnership, multiple partnerships, is the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map. And this is a map that shows the relative conditions of your environmental health disparities based on the vulnerability of the community or individual health conditions, and the pollution exposures or pollution burden in your community. And this was done in partnership with Front and Centered, University of Washington, Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, Department of Health, and specifically their environmental health tracking program called the Washington Tracking Network, and Department of Ecology. And so it was a community government academic partnership that came together to build this tool over 2 years. And so this ranks different conditions or different indicators from 1 to 10, 10 being high. And again, that relativeness being important, because when you're thinking about disparities and environmental justice and climate justice, it's who's going to experience it the worst and first, because that inevitably is happening right now and is going to worsen over time. And so you can picture this is, I believe, just for diesel emissions. So you can kind of almost draw the I-5 corridor with your eyes, because you can see which communities in the Puget Sound area is highly impacted by that. And ultimately, through the different partnerships, University of Washington built the technical aspect of the tool. Department of Health is now displaying the tool on their webpage. And with Front and Centered as a community coalition working on a lot of policy issues, this map is now integrated into the Environmental Justice Task Force. Recommendations that they did, again, last year, end of last year, and they really want to make sure that state agencies in the future really incorporate thinking about environmental justice, thinking about that demographic and environmental context, making sure that folks are thinking about the environmental justice aspect and the consequences of different actions when they are making decisions, and making sure to center these environmental justice communities as priority to get more resources to eliminate these disparities, but also be at the center of these conversations as well. Another example of kind of the outcome of a fruitful collaboration is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, where Department of Health, as of a few months ago, developed a cumulative impact analysis framework to assess who would be most impacted by climate change and is already impacted by fossil fuel pollution. And this tool is going to help inform power utilities planning for when they're transitioning to cleaner energy, making sure that these communities that are already impacted are not going to be left behind from co-benefits, and in the process of it, making sure that they're not disproportionately impacted by any decisions that are made along the way. And here's an example of how the distributional justice can be achieved through these different partnerships. So this is an example of Department of Ecology using one of these mapping tools in their decision making and making sure that they're really routing a lot of the resources to these disproportionately impacted communities to try and eliminate and reduce the disparities that they're experiencing today, yesterday, and most likely in the future. And so you can tell if you really direct these funds and really focus on a lot of your energy and resources into these, you can actually see some fruitful results, looking at the lifetime reduction of NOx and CO2, and thinking about, how powerful these community engagement and community partnerships can be when you work effectively together. And so I just wanted to kind of circle back and thinking about, how do you do this well? How do you do this? And what are the anticipated challenges, and how do you really foresee that? And making sure that whenever you do think about developing your thesis or your research project or your program, you do think about this in a broader lens and not just to the general, typical academic force, the academic institution, but thinking about diverse audience as in, community organizations, community members, the study community that participated in your study. How are you going to circle back with them and making sure that they help identify the next research goal, and that it's really initiated by the community and it's community driven, a community identified solutions that you're exploring. And also thinking about, what partnerships can you really nurture over time and maintain so that you can really get to the bottom of a lot of these issues over time. So one last thing I always like to end with is thinking about partnerships and community engagement. It's super critical to do evaluations, whether it's informal or formal, whether it's a survey, an in-depth, one-on-one interview. It's super important to evaluate not only the process of not only the outcome of the partnership, what and did you achieve your goals, what happened from that, but thinking about how you did along the way so that you can improve on your community engagement and your partnerships is super critical. And here's a study just as an example to demonstrate why. When you're asking folks about joint perceptions of joint work on a research project, were results and information prepared jointly? More academics thought yes, and less community advisors thought no. And it's important to think about this because who is this research going to report it back to? And if it's really meant for the community based on this partnership, then it should be, they should be involved all the way. This one is one of my favorites to really think about because for this partnership, they did a process evaluation and said there were communication problems, and then after some time asked whether those were resolved. And the confidence of researchers compared to community advisors still seeing the same thing, to me really resonates with me that, this is why it's so important to have that ongoing bidirectional, honest conversation and to maintain that trust over time with other folks in that partnership. And while you welcome, and develop new relationships that might bud from it and that might branch out of it. So yeah, I will stop right there.